The marshal laughed after knocking down a waitress, unaware that the deadly man behind him was his father. The morning sun rose slowly over the small town, casting golden light over dusty streets and wooden buildings. The town had a quiet charm, with children running along the sidewalks, shopkeepers opening their doors, and the soft sounds of horses' hooves clattering on the street. Among the familiar sights, one figure stood out immediately: the marshal. He walked down the main street with a confident stride, his long coat swaying behind him, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Every passerby knew him, and most greeted him with a nod or a smile. Some even tipped their hats in respect. He was a man used to authority, a man whose reputation preceded him. The marshal's mornings were always the same. He would start at the diner on the corner, grab a cup of strong coffee, and chat with the locals while keeping an eye on the town. This routine gave him a sense of control, and it helped him stay connected with the people he protected. Even though he was confident and brave, he liked to keep one foot in the normal life of the town, seeing it as a responsibility as well as a pleasure. People trusted him, and he carried that trust like a badge heavier than any gun. As he approached the diner, he noticed the usual crowd gathered outside. The morning chatter was lively. Farmers discussed the weather and crops, shopkeepers talked about business, and children laughed, running past with bundles of newspapers in their hands. The marshal tipped his hat to a few familiar faces, enjoying the warmth of being recognized and respected. He reached the steps of the diner, the smell of fresh bread and coffee wafting through the air. He pushed open the door with a hand resting casually on the handle of his revolver, though he had no intention of using it at the moment. The marshal believed in showing confidence and control, but he also liked to appear relaxed, almost careless at times, which made people underestimate him. Inside, the diner was bustling. The waitress moved quickly between tables, balancing trays of eggs, bacon, and steaming cups of coffee. She was young, full of energy, and well-liked by everyone in town. The marshal walked over to the counter, nodding to her with a smile. "Morning, Clara," he said, using the name everyone knew her by. "How's the day treating you so far?" Clara looked up from a stack of plates and smiled nervously. "Morning, Marshal. Busy as always. You know how it is." She placed a cup of coffee in front of him and tried to move away, but the marshal, always full of energy and a little too casual, stepped forward just as she turned. In a moment of playful clumsiness, he bumped into her and she stumbled backward. The tray wobbled in her hands and a cup of coffee almost spilled. The marshal caught it quickly, laughing. "Careful there," he said with a grin, patting her shoulder lightly. "You almost made me drink that before breakfast." Clara laughed nervously, brushing her hair back. "Marshal, you need to watch where you're going," she said, though she couldn't hide the warmth in her voice. She was used to his energy, but sometimes it startled her. The marshal chuckled, leaning against the counter casually, unbothered by the minor chaos he had caused. It was part of his charm, he thought. People liked a lawman who was confident but approachable, someone who could laugh at himself as easily as he could face danger. After a few minutes of small talk, the marshal stepped outside again. The streets were quieter now, with only a few people lingering in the morning light. He walked slowly, taking in the sights and sounds of the town. He noticed the children playing near the fountain, their laughter echoing off the buildings. A few townsfolk waved, and he tipped his hat in return. To an outsider, he might have seemed relaxed and carefree, but the marshal's eyes never stopped moving. He scanned the streets, noticing everything: the way a shadow moved, the slight shift in the wind, the glint of sunlight on distant windows. It was a habit, one that kept him alert, and one that had saved his life more times than he could count. As he continued down the street, he thought about the duties he carried. Being a marshal was not just about keeping order or catching criminals. It was about understanding people, about knowing when a situation could turn dangerous. He had faced many threats in his life, from reckless outlaws to desperate men driven by fear. He had learned to trust his instincts, to read signs that others often overlooked. And yet he also knew the importance of balance, of enjoying the small moments, of laughing with the people he protected. That balance made him human, made him approachable, and made people trust him. The marshal's mind wandered briefly to the stories he had heard about a dangerous stranger recently seen in town. Rumors whispered of a man with a violent past, someone feared by many. The marshal listened to the gossip but didn't dwell on it. He believed in facts, in action, not idle speculation. Still, there was a small twinge of curiosity in the back of his mind. Something about the way people spoke of this stranger caught his attention, a subtle unease that he couldn't ignore. He made a mental note to keep an eye out, though he didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. Turning a corner, he passed a small shop where a blacksmith was hammering metal over the anvil. The sound rang out across the street, rhythmic and steady. The marshal paused for a moment, watching the blacksmith work. It reminded him of the value of skill, of discipline, and of dedication. Every man had his tools, every trade its challenges, and every person had a role to play in the life of the town. As a marshal, his role was clear, but he often reflected on the lives around him, understanding that law and order were intertwined with ordinary life in ways both delicate and essential. As he walked further, the marshal approached the outskirts of the town square. A few men were loading crates onto a wagon, and a woman swept the steps of her small house. The marshal greeted them, receiving nods and smiles in return. Life seemed peaceful, almost idyllic, but the marshal knew better. He had learned over the years that danger often hid behind the calmest of faces, that threats could come from the most unexpected places. Still, he allowed himself this moment of serenity, taking pleasure in the ordinary, in the simple joys of life that made his duty worthwhile. He stopped briefly at the fountain in the center of the square, watching the water ripple in the morning light. Children played nearby, splashing and laughing. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh bread and morning dew. The marshal took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over him. He smiled to himself, feeling a rare moment of peace. It was a fleeting sensation, he knew, but one he cherished. Life as a lawman was unpredictable, and these quiet mornings were treasures in a world often ruled by chaos. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye from the edge of the square. A tall figure stood in the shadow of a building, watching. The marshal's smile faded slightly, his instincts alert. The stranger was silent, his presence almost unreal in its stillness. For a moment, the marshal studied him carefully, noting every detail, the posture, the way he held himself, the intensity in his eyes. There was something familiar about the man, something that tugged at a memory buried deep within. Yet the marshal shook his head, dismissing the thought. Perhaps he was imagining things. Small towns always had strangers passing through, and most posed no real threat. With a shake of his head, he turned back to the street, continuing his walk. But the sense of unease lingered. The marshal's laughter earlier, his playful bump with the waitress, his light-hearted demeanor, all of it seemed distant now, overshadowed by a subtle tension he couldn't explain. He had learned long ago that life could change in an instant, that danger often arrived when least expected. And though he did not yet realize it, the quiet presence of the man in the shadow would soon challenge everything the marshal believed about family, trust, and the world he thought he understood. For now, however, the marshal remained unaware. He tipped his hat to a passing child, chuckled at a joke made by a shopkeeper, and continued down the street with confidence. The town carried on around him, oblivious to the silent observer who had arrived. Life seemed ordinary, peaceful, and predictable. And in that brief morning, the marshal could still laugh, still enjoy the warmth of the sun, still believe that the world was as simple and clear as it appeared. But life, as he would soon learn, was never so simple. The events set in motion by a single glance, a single movement, and a single stranger were quietly unfolding. And the marshal's laughter, innocent and carefree, would soon collide with a truth he had never imagined, one that would challenge everything he knew about courage, duty, and the bonds of blood. The town's morning calm carried on, but beneath it, an unusual tension lingered. The marshal walked with his usual confidence, yet he could not shake the subtle feeling of being watched. He had faced danger before, but this unease was different. It was quiet, calculated, and it clung to the edges of his awareness like a shadow he could not see clearly. The stranger, tall and silent, moved slowly through the town, blending with the shadows. He observed from a distance, never revealing too much, yet his presence was undeniable. His eyes followed the marshal wherever he went, calculating, patient, and full of purpose. Every gesture, every smile, every laugh the marshal shared with the townspeople seemed to fuel the stranger's attention. He was not here to blend in. He was here for a reason, and that reason had been waiting for years. The stranger was a man of few words, his past shrouded in mystery. Stories whispered in other towns spoke of him as ruthless, efficient, and merciless when he needed to be. Criminals feared him, and even the bravest men gave him a wide berth. His reputation preceded him, but here, in this small town, only hints of his presence were known. He had come quietly, letting his legend linger in whispers, knowing that fear was often more effective than open threats. He moved through the town square with careful steps, watching the marshal interact with townspeople. There was a strange familiarity in his gaze, one that tugged at something buried deep within him. He had left a life behind long ago, leaving a son without a father and a family without closure. The town did not know him, and he intended to keep it that way for now. His goal was not chaos, it was purpose. Every movement, every decision he made was part of a larger plan, one that required patience and precision. The marshal, meanwhile, remained unaware. He continued his rounds, greeting townsfolk, checking on the stables, and making small talk with shopkeepers. His laughter echoed in the streets as he teased a blacksmith about his work, yet a part of him remained alert. It was instinct, honed through years of facing danger. He noticed the slightest shift in shadows, the movement of a distant figure, and the sound of footsteps that didn't match the rhythm of the town. Yet, every time he looked for a threat, the stranger was gone, leaving only the faintest hint that someone had been there. Inside the diner, Clara, the young waitress, bustled about, cleaning tables and serving customers. She noticed the marshal's occasional distracted glances toward the street and frowned slightly. "Marshal," she asked, her voice quiet but concerned, "is everything all right?" "You seem different today." The marshal smiled, a bit forced, and shook his head. "Nothing to worry about, Clara, just keeping my eyes open. You never know when trouble might show up." He chuckled lightly, trying to ease the tension. But deep down, he felt the stirrings of unease, a feeling he could not ignore. Something was different today, and he could not put his finger on it. Outside, the stranger paused near the edge of the square, watching as the marshal moved along the streets. There was a faint sadness in his eyes, hidden beneath a hardened exterior. Memories of the past haunted him, memories of a young boy, a home left behind, and mistakes that could never be undone. Yet he was not here for nostalgia, he was here for purpose. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, and leading toward an inevitable confrontation. The stranger's movements were fluid and quiet, almost like a shadow moving across the ground. He avoided drawing attention, slipping behind buildings, and using the narrow alleyways to his advantage. He observed the marshal's interactions carefully, noting the way he carried himself, the subtle gestures of his body, and the ease with which he commanded respect. It was clear to him that the boy he had left behind had grown into a man, confident, capable, and unaware of the past that was about to catch up with him. As the day wore on, the marshal continued his routine, making rounds through the town, checking on the stables, and stopping briefly at the blacksmith to exchange a few words. Every interaction was light and casual on the surface, yet his mind remained sharp, scanning for any sign of trouble. The feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. Something told him that danger was near, though he could not yet see its form. Meanwhile, the stranger took a different approach. He did not confront the marshal directly. He chose to test him. Small, subtle actions, moving objects slightly, leaving traces of his presence and observing the marshal's reaction, were part of a larger plan. He wanted to see how his son would respond, to understand the man he had become, and to prepare for the moment when revelation could no longer be delayed. Every test was calculated, designed to provoke a reaction without causing harm. The marshal, unaware of these subtle tests, noticed the small anomalies and shook his head. "Must be my imagination," he muttered to himself. Yet the tiny shifts in the environment, the faint signs of someone else's presence, gnawed at him. He had learned to trust these instincts, and though he ignored them at first, he felt a tension building, a tension that promised change, conflict, and challenge. As afternoon approached, the town grew quieter. Shops began closing for a short break, and the streets emptied slightly. The marshal took the opportunity to visit the outskirts, checking the barn where he often kept his horse. He moved with ease, familiar with every detail of the town and every routine of its people. Yet even in these familiar surroundings, he could not shake the sense that something was different. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke from a nearby chimney, the shadows lengthened in unusual ways, and a sudden chill brushed against the back of his neck. From the shadows, the stranger observed. He allowed the marshal a brief moment of calm before he nudged events forward. A horse spooked near the barn, sending a loud whinny into the quiet streets. The marshal reacted instantly, moving to calm the animal, his hand resting on his revolver as he scanned the area. He knew the town intimately, yet this small disruption felt deliberate. The stranger watched closely, noting the marshal's reflexes, his calm under pressure, and the confidence he maintained even in unexpected situations. The marshal calmed the horse with a practiced hand, whispering softly and patting its neck. He smiled to himself, satisfied that the situation was under control. Yet, a nagging thought remained in his mind, an unexplainable feeling that something significant was about to happen. He shook his head, dismissing it, telling himself that small towns often had small surprises. Still, the tension lingered, unspoken, building quietly in the background. As evening approached, the stranger made his presence felt more clearly. He did not reveal himself fully but allowed glimpses, shadowy figures at the edge of vision, reflections in windows and fleeting movements near alleyways. The marshal noticed these subtle hints and paused, frowning. He felt a connection, a familiarity that he could not place. A memory tugged at the edges of his mind, something from a long time ago, before he had grown into the man he was today. Yet he ignored it, telling himself that the town had many strangers, and his mind was likely playing tricks. Still, curiosity mixed with unease, creating a tension that could not be ignored. He decided to finish his rounds and return to the diner, hoping that a familiar environment would ease the growing sense of discomfort. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh bread and coffee welcomed him. Clara greeted him with a warm smile, noticing the subtle change in his demeanor. "Marshal, you look thoughtful today. Something on your mind?" The marshal smiled faintly, sitting at the counter and accepting his usual cup of coffee. "Just keeping an eye on things," he said. Nothing more. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the presence of the stranger lingering outside, watching, waiting, and moving silently through the town. The sense of being observed was no longer subtle, it was unmistakable. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the streets. The marshal finished his coffee and prepared to leave, sensing that the day was far from ordinary. The tension in the air, the subtle disruptions, and the small hints of the stranger's presence created a sense of anticipation. Something was coming, and he would need every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage he had to face it. Unseen by the marshal, the stranger moved quietly toward the edge of the town. He paused, watching the marshal from a distance. There was a mix of emotion in his eyes, regret, pride, and a faint trace of longing. He had come a long way, carrying the weight of the past, and now he was close to the moment when everything would change. His purpose was clear, his patience tested, and the timing nearly perfect. Soon he would step from the shadows, and the marshal's world would never be the same again. For now, though, the town remained calm, the marshal still unaware, and the stranger hidden in plain sight. The stage was set, the tension built, and the inevitable meeting drawn closer with every passing moment. The ordinary streets, the familiar people, and the small routines of the town masked the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. And in that quiet, the first threads of a story began to pull tightly, drawing father and son toward a revelation neither could escape. The morning after the stranger had first appeared, the marshal woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. At first everything seemed ordinary. The sun rose slowly over the small town, golden and warm, casting long shadows on the streets. The town had a quiet rhythm, with shopkeepers opening their doors, children running errands for their families, and the faint sounds of horses in the distance. Yet, as the marshal moved through his morning routine, something felt off. He walked down the main street, tipping his hat to the few townspeople he saw. His steps were confident, but his eyes were sharper than usual. He noticed small details that might have gone unnoticed before: a crate slightly out of place, a shutter left open, and a shadow lingering longer than it should. Each small detail added to the sense of unease that had been growing in his chest since yesterday. The marshal trusted his instincts above all else, and they were telling him that something was not right. As he reached the diner, Clara was already busy at the counter. She looked up when she saw him, smiling as always, but her eyes reflected a hint of worry. "Marshal, did you hear about the strange man some folks saw near the edge of town yesterday?" she asked softly. The marshal leaned on the counter, taking a sip of his coffee. "I heard whispers," he said. "Did anyone get a good look at him?" Clara shook her head. "No one seems to know much, but he frightened some of the people. They said he moved quietly like a shadow, and he just disappeared before anyone could speak to him." The marshal frowned slightly, placing the cup down. "A stranger moving quietly isn't unusual," he said. "But something about your voice, you're worried." Clara hesitated, glancing at the door. "It's not just me. People in town feel it too. Something about him doesn't feel right. He's different." The marshal nodded slowly, his instincts sharpening. Something about the town had changed overnight. He had learned that subtle shifts often indicated larger dangers. A calm morning could hide a storm, and he had seen enough storms to recognize the warning signs. He thanked Clara, leaving a few coins on the counter, and stepped back into the streets. The town square seemed calm at first glance. Children ran across the fountain, playing tag as their laughter filled the air. Farmers moved through the streets with baskets of vegetables, and the blacksmith hammered metal rhythmically in his shop. But the marshal noticed small, unusual signs: messages scribbled in the dirt, items slightly out of place, and glances from strangers that lingered too long. Each sign was small, almost imperceptible, yet together they created a web of unease. He paused near the blacksmith, observing a man who seemed to linger in the shadows near the shop. The man looked ordinary at first, but his posture, the way he held himself, and the intensity in his eyes set the marshal on alert. He watched silently, trying to determine whether the man posed a threat. When the man noticed the marshal's gaze, he disappeared quickly around the corner, leaving no trace but a faint echo of movement. The marshal's hand rested on the grip of his revolver, not for confrontation yet, but for preparedness. The marshal spent the morning checking the outskirts of town. The barns, stables, and empty lots were all part of his usual patrol, but he could not ignore the feeling that someone had been there before him. Footprints, slightly disturbed soil, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in places where no one should have been. He studied each detail carefully, aware that someone was testing him, observing how he reacted and learning his patterns. The thought made him uneasy but also alert. He had trained for situations like this, where danger was invisible and patience was a weapon. Meanwhile, the stranger moved with deliberate caution. He left subtle signs for the marshal to notice, small traces that would provoke the lawman's curiosity and instincts. A boot print here, a shifted object there, even a slight sound of movement in the distance, all were part of a test. The stranger wanted to understand his son, to measure his skills and instincts, without revealing himself too early. Every detail was calculated, every movement intentional. He had learned long ago that patience and observation often achieved more than confrontation. Back in the town square, the marshal noticed a man unloading crates from a wagon. Something seemed odd. Some crates were heavier than usual, and the way the man moved suggested that he was hiding something. The marshal approached calmly, tipping his hat. "Morning," he said. "Everything all right here?" The man jumped slightly, startled by the marshal's sudden presence. "Why, yes, Marshal, just moving the crates." The marshal watched him carefully. "Everything seems normal," he said, though he did not sound fully convinced. "Mind if I take a look?" The man hesitated but nodded, allowing the marshal to inspect the crates. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the marshal noticed a subtle indentation in one of the wooden boxes, a mark that indicated recent handling by someone skilled. He made a mental note, storing the detail for later. Small signs like this often held the truth, and he trusted his instincts to guide him. As the day progressed, the marshal became increasingly aware of the stranger's presence. Each subtle test, each unusual event, strengthened the feeling that he was being watched. He felt a connection, a familiarity that he could not explain. Memories from his childhood surfaced briefly, shadows of a past he had almost forgotten. The feeling was fleeting, but it left a mark, a quiet, persistent tug at his mind. The marshal decided to check on his horse in the stables. He moved quickly but cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of tampering or unusual activity. When he arrived, he noticed the door slightly ajar. His heart rate quickened, though he maintained a calm exterior. Stepping inside, he found the horse calm, unharmed, and the stable otherwise undisturbed. Yet the small detail of the ajar door confirmed his suspicions. Someone had been here, observing or testing him. He closed the door behind him, his mind racing. Each piece of evidence, each subtle disturbance told a story. Someone in town knew his routines, understood his habits, and was deliberately testing him. The thought both disturbed and intrigued him. He had faced outlaws, criminals, and desperate men before, but this felt different. The presence was calculated, deliberate, and familiar in a way that unsettled him deeply. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the marshal returned to the town square. The streets had quieted, and a warm glow bathed the buildings in orange and gold. The atmosphere felt calm, almost peaceful, yet the marshal's instincts remained sharp. He could sense the tension lingering like a faint current beneath the surface. It was a warning, a signal that change was coming, and he needed to be ready. The stranger, still hidden, observed from a distance. He allowed the marshal a brief moment of calm before nudging events forward. A sudden noise, a horse's whinny, a crate falling, or the distant shout of a child disrupted the quiet. The marshal reacted instantly, moving toward the source and scanning for danger. Each reaction, each movement was noted by the stranger, a careful study of skill, patience, and instinct. The marshal calmed the small disturbance quickly, reassuring a frightened child and checking the area. He felt a mixture of relief and growing curiosity. The small town, once so predictable, was becoming a puzzle, each clue leading him closer to the truth. He had faced danger before, but this was different. The threat was hidden, intelligent, and patient, testing him in ways that forced him to question everything he knew about safety and vigilance. As evening fell, the marshal returned to the diner. Clara greeted him with concern in her eyes. "Marshal, are you all right? You seem tense." He smiled faintly, trying to mask his unease. "Just a long day. Keeping the town safe takes patience." He paused, glancing out the window at the quiet streets. "And sometimes the town teaches you lessons you weren't expecting." Clara nodded slowly, sensing there was more to his words than he let on. "I hope you're careful," she said softly. The marshal appreciated her concern, though he did not reveal his thoughts. He had learned long ago that some dangers were not spoken of, that observation and preparation were more powerful than words. He finished his coffee, left a few coins, and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, and the streets were bathed in soft shadows. The town appeared calm, but the marshal knew better. From the edges of the town, the stranger watched silently. He had tested his son, observed his reactions, and noted his instincts. The marshal was stronger, sharper, and more capable than he had expected. Yet the stranger's purpose remained unchanged. He would wait patiently until the right moment to step from the shadows. Every step had been deliberate, every test carefully placed, and soon the moment of revelation would arrive. The marshal, unaware of how close he was to the truth, walked the quiet streets with a mixture of confidence and alertness. The town seemed peaceful, but he felt the tension lingering like a shadow over the rooftops. Something extraordinary was about to unfold, and he could sense it in the air, in the subtle signs, and in the quiet, deliberate movements of a stranger whose presence had changed the town in ways no one yet realized. The sun was setting over the small town, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Shadows stretched across the streets, making the familiar corners and alleys seem mysterious and unfamiliar. The marshal walked carefully through the quiet town, his steps measured, his eyes scanning every detail. The feeling of being watched, which had haunted him for days, had grown stronger, and he knew instinctively that something significant was about to happen. He reached the outskirts of town, where the buildings thinned and the dirt road led into open fields. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Something was waiting for him. He could feel it in the tension of the air, in the way the shadows moved. The marshal stopped, listening. For a long moment there was nothing but silence, broken only by the faint sound of a distant horse and the rustling of leaves. Then he saw him. The figure stepped out from behind a large oak tree, tall and imposing. There was no hurry in his movement, no unnecessary gestures. He simply stood there, watching. The marshal froze, recognizing something in the man's posture, the strength in his frame, and the intensity of his eyes. A memory flashed in his mind, distant but vivid. A boy's laughter, a hand reaching out, a voice that he could not place. The feeling of familiarity struck him like a lightning bolt, sudden and shocking. "You," the marshal said, his voice low, hesitant. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly, almost sadly, as if he had been waiting a long time for this moment. "It's been a long time, son," he said softly. The words carried weight, and in them, a history of absence, regret, and unspoken truths. The marshal's eyes widened in disbelief. The voice, the tone, it was impossible, yet it could not be anything else. "Father?" the marshal asked, his voice barely audible. His mind raced, refusing to believe what he had just realized. The man standing before him, the one who had been observing him, testing him, and moving through the town like a shadow, was the father he had not seen in years. The father who had left him as a child, leaving a hole in his life and a string of unanswered questions. "Yes," the man replied simply, his gaze steady. "It's me. I never wanted you to know this way." I never wanted to bring danger to your life, but the world doesn't always wait for perfect timing." His voice was calm, almost gentle, yet it carried the weight of years spent apart, of decisions made in desperation, and of a life lived in the shadows. The marshal took a step back, his mind a storm of emotions. Shock, anger, confusion, and a strange longing collided inside him. "Why now? Why appear like this after all these years?" he demanded, though his voice wavered. "You left me, left my mother, left everything. And now you're here like nothing ever happened." The father's expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I had my reasons, reasons you might not understand yet. I left to protect you in the only way I knew. I made mistakes, big mistakes, but I always carried the hope that one day I could make things right." The marshal's hand moved instinctively to the handle of his revolver, though he did not draw it. His heart pounded, his mind a whirl of memories and feelings. He had grown up strong, independent, and capable, but the absence of his father had left a scar deeper than he had ever admitted, even to himself. And now, faced with the man who had shaped his past so profoundly, he did not know whether to feel anger, relief, or a complicated mix of both. "You left a lot behind," the marshal said, his voice tight. "You left me to grow up without guidance, without someone to show me right from wrong. And now you expect me to, what? Accept you after all this time?" The father nodded slowly. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I am not asking for forgiveness, and I am not asking you to forget. I am asking only that you hear me, that you understand that my actions, however flawed, were meant to protect you. I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping that I could make things right." The marshal felt a pang of something he could not name. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers, to punish the man for leaving him. Another part of him felt a strange pull, a connection he had not realized he missed. The years of absence, the longing for guidance, and the need for closure all collided in his heart, leaving him uncertain and raw. "You don't know what it's like to grow up without a father," the marshal said, his voice breaking slightly. "You don't know what it's like to look for someone who isn't there, to wonder every day why you were left behind." The father took a step closer, his expression calm but filled with emotion. "I know more than you think," he said softly. "I have watched from afar, I have learned who you have become, and I am proud of the man you are. But I also know that pride cannot erase the past, and it cannot undo the pain I caused." For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind whispering through the trees around them. The marshal's mind raced, memories flashing in rapid succession. His mother's quiet strength, the lessons he had learned alone, the nights spent wondering where his father had gone. And now here he was, standing before him not as a stranger, but as the man who had shaped so much of his life, even in absence. The town behind them was quiet, oblivious to the tension unfolding at its edge. The marshal felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief that he finally knew the truth, that the shadow he had felt for days had a name, a face, and a history. Unease because the man before him was not only his father but also a dangerous figure, a man capable of actions that could threaten the very town he had sworn to protect. "You came back for a reason," the marshal said, his voice steadying. "It's not just about reunion, is it?" The father shook his head. "No, I am here because there are things that must be resolved. My past, my mistakes, and the life I left behind. And you are stronger than I ever imagined. But your strength will be tested in ways I could not prepare you for. That is why I have come, to face the truth, to confront what was left unresolved, and to protect what still matters." The marshal's mind raced. He had trained for danger, faced criminals, and dealt with threats to the town, but this was different. This was personal. The man before him was not just a threat or an ally, he was family. And family, he realized, brought complications that no lawbook or skill could prepare him for. "Why now?" he asked again, more calmly this time. "Why not before? Why not when I could have understood?" The father's eyes softened, filled with regret. Timing is a cruel teacher, he said. I could not return before. Circumstances, enemies, and choices made in desperation kept me away. But the time has come when hiding is no longer possible and the truth must be faced. You are ready now, even if you do not realize it. The marshal felt a mixture of anger and understanding. He wanted answers, explanations, and perhaps even an apology. Yet beneath the anger, a small part of him felt relief. Relief that the shadow following him, the figure testing him, had a name, a history, and a reason. The complicated emotions twisted inside him, leaving him both wary and intrigued. You could have made things simpler, the marshal said, his voice quieter now. Instead, you came in shadows, testing me, leaving signs and making me chase after a truth I didn't even know existed. The father nodded. I did not know another way. I had to be sure you were ready, that you could face the reality without being destroyed by it. Life has a way of preparing us for truths we do not want to face, and sometimes the only way to prepare is to test, to observe, and to wait. The marshal's hand lingered near his revolver, a gesture of readiness, not aggression. He understood instinctively that this confrontation was not only about words, but also about trust, skill, and restraint. The father had shown him his strength, his resourcefulness, and his instincts. And now, in the quiet of the approaching night, the moment had arrived when truth and consequence met. The father stepped forward, a calm intensity in his eyes. I am here not to take from you but to offer understanding. I have failed you, yet I hope that in facing the truth together we may find a way forward. You are my son, and whatever comes, know that I do not regret my intentions, even if my actions were flawed. The marshal felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. The anger, confusion, and shock remained, but so did a strange sense of clarity. The man before him was dangerous, skilled, and capable, but he was also human. And for the first time in years, the marshal felt a connection, however fragile, to the family he had longed for. Even as the night deepened, the quiet tension between them remained, unbroken by words or gestures. The revelation had changed everything. The marshal now knew the truth. The past was no longer hidden, and the path forward, though uncertain, was laid bare before them. The night had fully descended over the small town, casting long shadows across the streets and empty alleys. The last light of day had faded, leaving only the soft glow of lanterns and the occasional flicker from a shop window. The marshal walked carefully, his boots clicking lightly on the wooden sidewalks, his eyes sharp, scanning every corner. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, as if the town itself held its breath. He had faced danger before, but nothing compared to this night. The truth of the stranger, the man he had just learned was his father, still echoed in his mind. Confusion, anger, and curiosity mingled with his usual resolve. He had to protect the town, yes, but he also had to confront a man who was part of his past, a man who had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. Every instinct screamed caution, but his heart demanded clarity. The streets were quiet, too quiet, and the marshal's grip tightened on his revolver. He moved deliberately, each step measured, alert to the faintest sound. From the shadows, his father watched him, a calm and steady presence, his eyes reflecting both pride and regret. He had observed his son's reactions throughout the day, testing his instincts, gauging his abilities, and now the time for words alone had passed. The confrontation was inevitable. Suddenly, movement in an alley caught the marshal's attention. A figure darted across the street, and instinctively he drew his revolver, aiming carefully. The man stopped, raising his hands, but the marshal did not lower his weapon immediately. The tension between them was electric, a mixture of caution, fear, and anticipation. "It doesn't have to be this way," the father said calmly, his voice carrying across the empty street. "I am not your enemy, but I cannot hide from the truth any longer." The marshal lowered his weapon slightly but remained alert. "Then don't hide," he said. Show me why you're here. Why now? Why all the testing, all the shadows?" The father stepped forward slowly, his hands visible, a gesture of peace and trust. "Because I had to know you were ready," he said. "Ready to face not only me but the truth of our past. Life forced me to walk a dangerous path, and now that path has led me back to you. I wanted to ensure you could stand strong, even if I failed to guide you when you were a boy." The marshal's eyes narrowed, searching for signs of deceit. "Testing me by scaring the town, by moving like a shadow?" he asked. His voice held frustration but also an underlying note of understanding. "You didn't trust me. You didn't trust your own son." The father's expression softened. "I trusted you to survive, to grow into the man you are, but I could not risk revealing myself until I was sure. The world is not forgiving, and danger lurks in places we cannot see. I had to be certain you were prepared." The marshal exhaled, a mixture of relief and lingering tension washing over him. Yet, even as he felt the pull of understanding, a new sound reached his ears, the distant clatter of hooves and the whisper of shadows moving closer. The town was not as empty as it seemed. Allies of his father, men who had followed him from distant places, were approaching, drawn by the same sense of purpose that had brought him here. "Enemies?" the marshal asked, instinctively moving toward a safe position behind a barrel. "Not all," the father said. "But some are, and they do not care for the lives of this town." His voice was steady, calm, yet edged with determination. "We must act together if we are to protect what matters." The marshal considered his options. Every lawman's instinct told him to confront danger with precision, to protect the innocent at all costs. Yet, now, he faced not only a threat but the man who had been absent from his life, the man whose guidance he had never received. He weighed his emotions carefully, anger, confusion, and a lingering bond of blood. In that moment he made a choice. "Then we act together," he said, his voice firm. "But remember, I answer to the law first. Protecting this town comes before anything else." The father nodded. "I would expect nothing less." From the shadows, the first figures emerged, moving with silent precision. They were skilled, dangerous, and determined. The marshal and his father moved as one, a combination of instincts honed by experience and shared purpose. Each action was deliberate. The marshal's careful aim, his awareness of the surroundings, and the father's calm, calculated movements created a balance of strategy and skill. The clash was brief but intense. The enemies moved quickly, testing their defense, but the marshal and his father countered with efficiency. Every shot, every maneuver was deliberate, aimed at neutralizing threats without unnecessary harm. The town streets became a stage for a careful dance of skill and precision, and through it, the bond between father and son grew stronger. They moved as a unit, not just by necessity but by instinct, a connection forged in danger and reinforced by blood. After the confrontation, the enemies retreated, recognizing that the combined strength of the marshal and his father was too formidable. The town remained safe, but the quiet after the battle was heavy, filled with the weight of emotion and the gravity of revelation. The marshal lowered his weapon, feeling both relief and lingering tension. "Why didn't you tell me the truth before?" he asked, his voice quieter now, filled with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "I feared it would destroy you," the father said. "You were strong, yes, but you needed to grow into the man you are today. Only now could I reveal myself without causing irreparable harm. Life forced us apart, but tonight we have faced the consequences together." The marshal nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. The anger and confusion that had burned inside him began to settle, replaced by a cautious understanding. His father had made mistakes, yes, but the love and concern that underpinned his actions were undeniable. As they walked through the empty streets, the town quiet and peaceful once more, the marshal reflected on the events. He realized that the challenges of the past, the shadows that had followed him, and the dangerous tests had all shaped him into the man he was. And now, standing beside his father, he understood that the bonds of blood, though strained and tested, were unbreakable in their own way. "You could have been gone forever," the marshal said softly, looking at his father. "And yet here you are, standing beside me." "I never truly left," the father replied. "I have always watched, always cared, even from the shadows. I may have failed in presence, but not in concern. And tonight we faced both truth and danger together." The marshal's heart felt lighter, though the scars of absence and betrayal remained. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he also understood that the first step had been taken. Together, they had protected the town, faced danger, and confronted the past. The bond between them, fragile yet undeniable, had begun to heal. The town's lights twinkled softly, the quiet streets echoing the peace restored by their actions. The people, unaware of the full scope of the night's events, slept safely, trusting that the marshal's presence ensured their security. And as father and son stood together, watching over the town, a new understanding emerged, one of patience, trust, and the enduring strength of family, even when tested by time and circumstance. The father turned to the marshal one last time that night. "We have faced much, and there is still more to understand," he said. "But know this, my son, whatever comes, we face it together, and in that there is strength, trust, and hope." The marshal nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had learned that strength was not only about skill, courage, or law enforcement. It was also about understanding, forgiveness, and connection. The night had tested him in ways he could not have anticipated, but he emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the complexities of life, family, and responsibility. Together, father and son walked through the quiet town, the shadows no longer threatening, the tension eased, and a new chapter beginning. The past had been revealed, the present secured, and the future, though uncertain, was approached with courage, wisdom, and a shared bond that neither danger nor absence could ever erase. The marshal knew that life would continue to present challenges, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had faced danger, confronted the truth, and stood with the man who was both a stranger and his father. And in that understanding, he found peace, purpose, and the knowledge that even the most complicated truths could lead to connection, strength, and hope.